All right, my fellow nerds, it's history time. We are continuing our study in the background history of the Bible. Specifically, we're getting into the history of the time period between the Old and New Testaments. That's really where we're starting to go in earnest as we begin this. Again, as always, please feel free to ask questions, make comments, ask for clarification, so forth and so on, because a lot of what we're going to start covering, especially what we're starting again to tonight, and then what we'll be getting into for the next 3 or 4 times that we do this together, it's going to be some very interesting. It's also going to be some, how shall I say, very, I don't want to say obscure, very infrequently taught, maybe. We don't talk about a lot of these things that we're going to talk about as much as we should, because it's going to shed a whole lot of light, I believe, on how the Jews especially were thinking and where their culture was at by the time we get to the New Testament. It's going to help us understand how people responded to Jesus, how a lot of the groups that opposed Jesus formed and why they opposed him the way they did. All of those things we're going to be able to see, I think, a little better as we begin to especially look at this time between the Testaments, what sometimes is called intertestamental history. So we talked last week about Alexander the Great. That's the only time, as far as I'm aware, that we're going to spend an entire session of this history stuff talking about one single individual. But in terms of the impact he had on the world, he deserves a whole lesson unto himself. We talked about how he was able from just this tiny area in Macedonia to first unite Greece and then conquer probably one of the biggest areas in terms of just land mass that had ever been conquered up to that time by certainly a single individual, perhaps even a single empire. His domain stretched all the way from what we would now call Greece in the Mediterranean Sea to the borders of India. And he only stopped because his troops said, "We need a break. You've been pushing us so hard because we've been conquering literally everybody and haven't lost a battle, yes, but we're tired." And so eventually he had to calm down, and then he died. At 33 years old, he passed away. We talked about how there were different reasons, possibly reasons for that. We don't know exactly why. But nonetheless, one person in this tiny, tiny amount of time be able to conquer this vast region under one, not just person, but one kind of society, one kind of civilization, talking about the Greek civilization, that has an impact. Anytime you have that massive of a change, it's going to have an impact. So what we're going to talk about tonight is kind of the aftermath of Alexander. We're calling it the Hellenization of the world. Anyone know what Hellenization means? Helen, yes, we're talking about Helen's influence on the world. That's what we're going to talk about tonight. No. Anybody know, though, what this word Hellenization is? 2 L's. That's why we know it's not Miss Helen. 2 L's. What is that? Do what? I heard somebody say something. Oh, come on. Now you're shy.
Those that were new to the Jewish religion.
Do what?
Those that converted to the Jewish religion.
Not quite. That would be proselytes, or people who converted through proselytization. That's another fun, long word. Anyone ever heard the term, or I really call it a name, Hellas? Hellas or es. I think it's as technically. That is, in Greek, the name for what we would now call southern Greece. So Hellenization is basically making Greek. So what we're going to look at tonight is the slow process by which a large portion of the world was made Greek. Yes?
Are we going to talk about the term Hellenistic Jews?
Ah, okay, good. Thank you for saying that. So that may be what you were referring to, Ralph, Hellenistic Jews. So Hellenistic Jews are Jews who have adopted some aspects of Greek culture. So they are Jewish either by becoming proselytes, or they may be Jews just by birth, but they have actually kind of the other way. They've converted to some of the Greek practices, at least in terms of culture, maybe not religion. But we'll talk about that a little more in a moment. So yes, thank you, Alyssa, for bringing that up, because that makes sense that we're want to connect those two. So I'm glad you brought that up, Ralph. So the Hellenization of the world, making the world more Greek. What does that mean even? What are we talking about when we say that? I mean, the world didn't become all part of Greece in the sense of, well, this is all Greece now. When we look at a map today, we don't see a large chunk of the world. It's still that small little area that's Greece. Well, let's think about what happens in the aftermath of Alexander the Great. So we talked last time. He dies at a very young age at 33 years old. He has this massive area that he has just conquered and brought under his control in this short period of time. Now, if you have conquered a whole bunch of area in a short period of time, what does that say about how long your empire will last? It doesn't, right? Because you barely had control of it for any time at all. And if you're the one who conquered it, if it's all centered around a single individual, I'm not trying to get into politics, but when you have a cult of personality built around a single individual, a lot of times that can kind of begin to dissipate as soon as that individual is no longer there for whatever reason. In this case, once Alexander's dead, well, it was all about him personally. He is the one who did all these things. It was his zeal. It was his military genius. It was his, just him that made all this possible, and all the circumstances falling right for him to seize this opportunity. So what happens when all this falls apart? Or rather, when he dies, all of this is potentially going to fall apart. So at Alexander's deathbed, you have his wife, you have all these other, people trying to care for him and so forth. You also have his friends, who we might put an asterisk by. They were also his most loyal generals. They had loyalty over certain parts of Alexander's army. They had certain aspects of control over certain areas, for example, that he had them garrison at certain times. So it shouldn't surprise us, since Alexander didn't have an heir and had barely reigned long enough to really establish any kind of dynasty, it shouldn't surprise us that the generals, the ones who were under him in command and have the loyalty of the army, they are going to begin to try and take over. Now, if you are a general and you have this massive empire that Alexander's built, what's the best case scenario just for you personally? Alexander has died. Now you're one of his most loyal generals. What would you like to happen? I'd like to be in Alexander's shoes exactly, right? I want to get it all. Unfortunately, you're not the only general. There are multiple generals, all of whom have a claim to being one of Alexander's right-hand men, all of whom have a claim to being very good at what they do, let's just put it that way, right? So all of them say, well, I have a claim too. So at first, they make kind of a compromise. And it's a compromise that none of them wanted, but it was a compromise by necessity. Well, there's too many of us, we're going to have to split it up. So that's what you see right after Alexander's death. Really, what you end up with immediately afterward is 5 different factions. And this is going to change constantly in the decades after Alexander's death. So at first, you essentially have these 5 areas. So Seleucus, one of the generals, he's going to take essentially the far east, so over there toward India and Persia and all that area. Antigonus, he's going to take this area over here in mainly Asia Minor and also some of this area in the Fertile Crescent, including Israel and some of those places. Ptolemy, one of the other generals, he's going to take Egypt and that area. And then you have Cassander and Lysimachus. They're going to be fighting over who gets what in Macedonia and so forth. We're not really going to worry too much about these 3 up here, Cassander, Lysimachus, and Antigonus, as we move forward, because they're not going to be as relevant for some of the things relating specifically to Israel, which is interesting, right? Because Antigonus at first controlled Israel, but that quickly is going to change. So I just want us to get a picture of it kind of splits early on, and everyone's like, okay, we'll just go our own separate ways. We'll all govern our own little regions, and we'll continue Alexander's dream. Oh, hey, I want what you have. Backstab, right? Immediately it falls apart. Immediately they're all at each other's throats. And that continues for a long, long time. Ultimately, if we really want to be literal about it, that continues until Rome just takes everybody over. In one sense or another, this infighting between these successors, they're sometimes called the successor kingdoms, or sometimes called, I believe, I always mispronounce this, Diadochi, I think is how you say that. Just literally means successor in Greek. That these successor kingdoms, they're constantly vying for who's going to get it all. And ultimately, part of the result of that infighting is that Rome gets to take them all one by one. So, in the meantime, they split off into these groups. Each one of them is trying to maintain their area, to build themselves up to be powerful, and hopefully one day to maybe make inroads into some of these other areas. And again, this map is going to constantly change. But guess what all of these leaders, and the ones that will succeed them, guess what they all have in common? They're all still Greek. And therefore, they all still have some of the same background, some of the same culture, and they're going to begin trying to spread that same culture. We'll talk about that in more detail in just a moment, because that's kind of the point of tonight, is to look at what that looked like. But before we get into that, I want us to notice something back in Daniel. In Daniel chapter 8, notice the description. We talked about this goat and this ram, and we're explicitly told that ram represents Persia, and the goat represents Greece, and the goat has this really long horn, right? And that horn represents the first king, and we said there's no way that can be anything but Alexander in this prophecy. But notice what happens in Daniel chapter 8. Then when the goat became exceedingly great, the goat has already been identified explicitly for us in the text as Greece. When the goat became exceedingly great, he became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Well, what does that sound like? Alexander the Great dies, and all of a sudden his kingdom is split into pieces. I mean, that's just about as simple as we can make it in terms of a prophecy, and it certainly is how things played out. He becomes exceedingly great, he conquers all this, and then at the pinnacle of his power, he dies, the great horn's broken, and instead there come up these smaller horns, these smaller rulers, right, in his place. Now, sometimes people get really caught up in this 4, and as we talk about in Revelation all the time, we're dealing with prophecy, specifically apocalyptic type prophecy. This is not literal. What are the 4 winds of heaven? Are there literally like 4 jet streams that run through the Mediterranean world or something? Not to my knowledge anyway, right? What are the 4 winds of heaven? Okay. The best way for us to kind of make it make sense in our minds as closely as possible to how they would think, north, south, east, west, like Beth said. These are the 4 corners of the world. That's the same thing, right? When we talk about the 4 corners of the earth, they're talking about every direction, every point on the compass, every which way you can point, every which way you can look. That's the idea. So not that there are literally 4, as we said, throughout the history of the successors of Alexander, all these successor kingdoms that came up out after him, there were all sorts of numbers. Sometimes there were 3, sometimes there were 5, sometimes there were 4, sometimes I think they even got up to 6 or something like that. I mean, they're constantly vying for power. There's never a set number, but that's not what Daniel's trying to say. He's not trying to say there's literally 4. He's saying in every direction you look, there's another successor, right? And they're all fighting for power. That's the whole point of this. And notice what he says then. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion, do as he will. This is now in chapter 11. So that great king, once again, we have another reference to Alexander. And notice what happens. As soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his posterity. Alexander the Great did not have an heir, once again, nor according to the authority with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others besides these. None of the successors ever united the kingdom back into the size and grandeur that it was during that brief time under Alexander. It was always less, None of the people were ever his actual successors in terms of heirs, in terms of those who would by right of, birth to the former king, he's the prince or whatever. That never happened. They were all divided and eventually, ultimately, just all kind of fell apart. So we see this very thing, Alexander's empire, and then ultimately the breaking up of that empire on his death. We see all this prophesied in the book of Daniel. So again, while we are looking at things that take place after the Old Testament's already written and all that, this is still mentioned in the Old Testament, and I think that's very relevant. But let's get back to this idea of Hellenization. So we have all of these areas that Alexander conquered. Now he's gone, and these other generals have snapped up pieces of his empire for themselves. And they're trying to build these things in empires. Well, they're Greek. Well, what does that mean? Well, if you were, as an American, given control of a large area of the world, what would your tendency be in how you conduct that area? Would you probably try and design, for example, the government as some kind of democracy, republic, something like that? Well, that's what we're used to, isn't it? And that's what we tend to think is the best form of government. So you'd probably establish the government like you were used to in your culture. What about the aspects of like art or language or something like that? Well, if you're the leader, if you're the king or queen and you speak, in this case, English, well, you would require everyone else, if they come to court, to speak English. That's the official language because that's your language, right? And you're the one in charge. All of those kind of things, that's why you see this Greek influence begin to spread. But not only that, remember what we said last time. Greece is quickly becoming, even just in general, it's becoming regarded, or it's being regarded more and more as the society or the culture in terms of refinement, in terms of advancement. It is the most cultured society of the day. Not to say there weren't other cultures, but more and more Greece and Greek culture, whatever we're going to talk about, and we're going to look at more of this in a second, all these different aspects began to be seen as the way to be cultured. So what does that look like? Well, one thing we looked at is philosophy, right? We talked about that a little bit last time. Alexander the Great, he is tutored by Aristotle himself. You have other philosophers that arise close to, or during the rise of Greek culture, like Plato and Socrates. And people more and more begin to respect these thinkers and how they begin to see the world, how they begin to use logic and reason to understand things. Now, if you go back and read them, some of them are kind of crazy, but at the same time, you can understand why they were appreciated because they do have a lot that they bring to the table in terms of how to use logic and reason. So that's one of the contributions. But that's not the only thing that Greek culture had going for it. Let's think about some, there we go. Let's think about some other aspects. Anyone know what this is? Do what? It's not a coliseum. This is close in that it's a place where you can have a lot of people for a spectacle, if you will, but it's not a coliseum. It's an amphitheater. This is where you would have plays sometimes. I don't know if they would perform music as often in these. I really don't know. I know nowadays one of the big things, even in like modern amphitheaters or venues like that, is you have like concerts and stuff. But definitely this would be a place where you would have plays and performances of like poetry and things like that. Everyone would gather there. That's also, by the way, and I want us to kind of start thinking in this way, although we're not there yet, but this is also the kind of place where you would have, for example, town meetings. If you needed someone to address the group at a crowd, or the crowd in a city or an area or something like that, you would go to a place like the amphitheater where the speaker could be heard and everyone could listen. This is the context and the kind of setting for example, some of the speeches given by people like Paul as he's going through some of these more Greek cities. You would have them gathered in places, something like this or an area similar to this where people could hear. So you have amphitheaters where these productions can be performed. Now, we think about Hollywood, right? Hollywood is a big deal. We, as a nation, I'm not saying necessarily us personally, because there's a lot to avoid in Hollywood, but I imagine all of us, enjoy at least some of what Hollywood produces. Maybe it's the older movies or the old westerns or whatever the case might be. But think about how much influence Hollywood has on our country. It's a lot, right? Because people constantly see what is being produced. Well, imagine if there's no television, there's no internet. What are you going to do to fill the void of that aspect of entertainment? Well, you're probably going to gravitate towards something like live theater. And Greece in particular was well known for producing great plays, great works of art in terms of theatrical productions and so forth. And that began to spread. One of the things you would have in a lot of Greek cities are these amphitheaters, and the influence of those could accomplish a lot, both just in terms of entertainment, but even sometimes in terms of satire, of swaying people's ideas. You have a lot of different elements of that. But let's think about something else. That black square is very intentional because even though it is a mosaic, I didn't want to have a nude picture up on the thing. This guy is very nude. You know why? Because he is working out at a Greek gymnasium. Guess what the one defining characteristic of Greek gymnasiums is? You work out naked. And I'm talking utterly and completely naked. That was part of the Greek culture in how they not just pursued, being fit, being in shape and so forth, but specifically, let's just throw this out there. Has any of y'all ever seen like Greek sculptures? Like sculptures of people like from the Greek period, whether it's supposed to be of someone Greek or whether it's actually was made during that time period. Yeah, you seen those? How are those people's bodies? And I'm not talking about anything gross. I'm just saying, like, are they in shape or are they like, the average American, right? No, they're like crazy in shape, right? Now I ask you, were most people in that good of shape even back in ancient times? No. Not the average person did not look like Michelangelo's statue of David, okay? So why did they make those sculptures that way? Because part of Greek culture emphasized a adoration of, glorification of the human physique. So it is this idea, we honestly, there's a sense in which the idea of humanism, although that's kind of more of like a 17th, 18th century idea, there's a sense in which humanism, as in the kind of putting all the focus on and glorifying humans in their just essence of what it means to be human, in a sense, that's also a very Greek thing. So you would go to this gymnasium, and part of going to the gymnasium is to glorify the human form, to sculpt it, to make it into something that is a reflection of the glory of mankind, if you will. And I'm trying to say this in a way that is helpful for us to understand rather than just getting down in the weeds of exactly the philosophy of it. But this is something that was very, very common. Now, you want to talk about something really gross. Again, I'm not trying to go too down there, but this also pertains to what they would do with their games. We're familiar with the Olympics, right? Well, that comes from Greek culture. They started the Olympic Games. Olympus, that is a Greek place, right? And so they would have these games there. They would practice at places like gymnasiums to perform, to compete in these games, and they would also do that naked. They would perform, they would compete in these games naked. Things like boxing and even wrestling and stuff like that. And that just grosses me out on so many levels. But that was part of their culture. They glorified this aspect of mankind. It was not at all uncommon for there to be a fairly constant stream of nudity involved in just interacting day-to-day life in Greek culture. And guess what that's going to do when you start introducing Greek culture into Jewish culture? We're going to come back to that. Another aspect of Greek culture. Probably impossible to tell what this is. I wouldn't know unless I had gotten the picture and had a caption on it, right? But this is a depiction of what is called, and I believe I'm pronouncing this correctly, an agora. Some might pronounce it agora, but I think it's agora. It is the marketplace. That's another aspect of Greek culture that you have put into a city. All these things that we're looking at would be some of the first structures placed in a Greek city. This is the center of their culture kind of emanating out. We start planting these cities and put Greek things in them. We build a gymnasium, we build an agora, we build a bath, we build a temple, we build all these different things, a school for philosophy eventually, all these different things. This is how you design something Greek, and the culture begins to spread out. So you have an agora. This is a place where you can buy and sell and trade, and let's not make any mistake, all the other cultures had some kind of marketplace, but part of what makes Greece unique, especially as we begin to move forward, well, is it easy to buy and sell and trade if you have different currencies and different languages? It's not so easy, is it? What about if you have one language and one currency? That's one of the things, and we're going to talk about language in a second, that's one of the things that Alexander and his successors began implementing. This is the official language. This is the official currency. And therefore, all of a sudden, trade becomes way easier. Another aspect, again, language, right? I don't know exactly what this says. I forget. It's a inscription on something, and what it says is important. The point is, this language, this Greek language, began to spread more and more and more across the Mediterranean world. It was a language that, in many ways, even today, if you study Greek, Greek is actually not a difficult language at all. It's difficult because we're not familiar with it. But you realize how hard English is if you're not familiar with it? If you compare the two, if you had never had any familiarity with English or with Greek, I would say, just in my own limited capacity, I would say Greek is at least 4 times easier. I'm not exaggerating. Now, again, this is my opinion. But I would say, just in my own experience, Greek is at least 4 times easier to learn than English. English just has so many weird rules, so many strange exceptions to rule, all these different things. And it's no surprise, right? Because English is really a hodgepodge of a bunch of different languages kind of meshed together into one. Greek is a very simple language on many levels. So it was pretty easy for a lot of different people to learn this language, right? And to begin to speak it to each other, to interact using this language, and therefore that creates, once again, more unity among these groups of people. You also have literature. I'm just going to be kind of brief on this. This is an image of a man named Homer. We might have mentioned him already once or twice. He's the one who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, some of the original renowned works of literature in all of ancient history. Some of the things that we point to, it's like, this is really when you start seeing literature begin to enter into this amazing age kind of thing. Well, he's the guy who did that. And as we saw when we looked at Alexander the Great carried a copy of Homer with him. He was inspired by this story of these great deeds, and that's what Alexander wanted to be. He wanted to be great. He wanted to be this hero people would write poems about, right? Well, even today, if you're going to study any kind of literature, do like a degree in literature, guess what you're going to study? You're going to study Homer for one, right? He still, even today, has a lasting influence. Well, literature has a great degree of, how shall we say, it has a great degree of power in a very real sense. Not necessarily that it has a specific, talk about power, not necessarily that it has a specific agenda to it, although sometimes it does, but even, for example, Homer, I don't think he had much of an agenda. He's writing this fantastic, poem about all these events, but it still has this power just in the sense of appeal to people, in the sense of, if I'm talking with this other person, oh, have you read Homer? Oh, of course I read Homer, right? This kind of common ground that you have there. So all of those things, again, we're trying to summarize. Y'all know I could keep talking about this kind of stuff forever. But all these things we've looked at, the marketplace, the gymnasium, the idea of literature and language, and all these different elements, what you see happening, both during Alexander's brief reign, but especially in his successors, is they are spreading all of these things. They are encouraging people to participate in all of these things. they're not, at least at first, really forcing it as much as they're saying, this is the way to be civilized. This is the way to be cultured. Please join us in, as your Greek overlords, we'll miss that, right? We won't emphasize that too much, but please join us in incorporating these elements of our culture into yours. That was a big focus for these successor kingdoms as we move forward. So as we wrap up, one more thing I want to mention, Greek religion. Greek religion was a very accessible religion. It was a religion that could be made to work well with just about any other religion. Remember, in the ancient world, no one denies any of the gods exist. Typically speaking, if you live in the ancient world, all the gods are real. You just have your favorites that you think are more happy with you than with other people. And my God is better than yours, right? Kind of a my dad could beat up your dad type deal. Yes, it was that stupid sometimes. Well, it was that stupid all the time, right? Because they didn't even exist. But in their minds, it wasn't that the gods don't exist. It's just that we have better ones. Well, Greek religion in particular did a really good job of kind of making all these other religions mesh with Greek religion. So let's say, for example, and these two are completely unrelated. Well, no, I'll use one that's related. Let's say Egypt. You have Ra, for example, right? Well, Greek religion could take Ra and say, well, that's just another name for Zeus. Well, all of a sudden, we don't have a problem. We can mesh these two religions together, and that's yet another thing that binds our cultures together and makes everything a little more Greek. That's what you begin to see happening more and more in the wake of Alexander. Now, as we conclude, and we'll review this next time, I told you all this is changing, right? This map, this is the same area, but it's just a different drawing of this map. All this is changing. This blue, as we move on, this is Ptolemy, this is Egypt, stays about the same. But this yellow, that's Seleucus. Now remember, earlier it was like over here, that was it. Right there on that blue, you can see it perfectly. So, what we see as we have this, there we go, is that Seleucus in particular is beginning to really expand. And notice right here, you know what that area is? That's Israel. Seleucus and Ptolemy start fighting over who is going to control Israel during this period. And eventually Seleucus wins. And that is going to have a major impact on what happens to the Jews during this time period. Notice, even in Daniel, we still have a reference to this. Out of one of them, this is talking about these successors, came a little horn which grew exceedingly great toward the south. Think Seleucus has this area up north, and then he starts moving south into, for example, Israel, toward the east and toward the glorious land. Well, where's that? Well, that's Israel. And Daniel is going to talk even more about what happens next. That's where we're going to go next. But before we do that, we'll be gone next week. So it'll be 2 weeks, maybe 3, depending. I'm not sure when the meal is. But whenever we come back, I want us to have just this basic idea in mind. The world is becoming more Greek. But we've already seen some problems, right? Some things that are Greek aren't going to mesh well with God's law. So what's going to happen? Well, I'll tell you what's going to happen. Conflict is going to happen. But we'll get into that next time. Any thoughts or comments as we wrap up this evening? All right. Like I say, it'll be a couple weeks or so, but just remember, Greek culture is spreading. That's going to have a major influence as we're moving through this period between the Testaments. As always, we want to offer an invitation. If there is anything we can help you all with, anything we can pray for you for, please let us know as we stand and as we sing together. Who at the door is standing?